Born in 1919, folk musician and political activist Pete Seeger began his music career in the late 1930s. His work with the Weavers was featured prominently on nationwide radio throughout the 1940s and 50s until he was blacklisted by McCarthy for his political views. Though a successful musician in his own right, his biggest contribution to the art was creating songs that would be covered by other artists, such as Frankie Vaughan, Peter, Paul and Mary, the Kingston Trio, Bobby Darin, the Four Seasons, Roy Orbison, Olivia Newton-John, Dolly Parton, Wilson Phillips, Leonard Nimoy, Johnny Cash, Bruce Springsteen, and Bernie Sanders. Yes, that Bernie Sanders, who recorded Where Have All the Flowers Gone in 1987. In 1959, Pete Seeger recorded Turn, 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 a hauntingly beautiful piece of folk music about the times and seasons, and all the things that occupy our short lives on Earth. A few years later, it was covered by The Byrds, and went straight to the top of the charts, becoming an international hit. But Pete Seeger didn't write most of the lyrics for that song. The bulk of it was taken verbatim from the first 8 verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 3, specifically the King James Version. The song preserves the original meaning of the chapter and remains one of my personal favorite pieces of folk music to this day. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons and Genesis. Vanity of vanities, all things are vanity. This pessimistic statement begins the book of Ecclesiastes, which is also called Qoheleth, and sets the tone for the remainder of the book. But before we get into that, we need to talk about the book itself. Qoheleth is traditionally ascribed to King Solomon for 2 reasons. Firstly, it's a piece of wisdom literature, and he's the wisest man in the Bible. Because of this, a great many books written over the course of about 1,000 years were attributed to him. Secondly, the first verse of the book states that these are the words of David's son who is king in Jerusalem, and Solomon is the son who became king. However, Solomon is never mentioned in the book of Ecclesiastes, and whenever the ostensible author is referenced, he's called Qoheleth, which isn't a proper name, but a word that can be understood as speaker, preacher, or teacher. A proper name for the author or the speaker is never once mentioned, and when the speaker is referenced, it's always done in the third person. So the speaker is not the same as the author of the book. If the author had been Solomon, he wouldn't have been referring to himself in the third person. Also, if the author had Solomon in mind, he would have mentioned him by name, as so many others did when falsely attributing their writings to the legendary king. Instead, the book is simply attributed to a son of David, who is a teacher, or the orator whose words have been recorded. Another problem with crediting Solomon with authorship is the dating of the text. Ecclesiastes is filled with Persian loanwords, placing the composition firmly in the post-exilic period, as the general style of Hebrew confirms. Also, chapter 12, verses 9 to 10 imply that the wise man made his living through teaching and writing, meaning this story was originally about an anonymous sage referred to simply as the teacher, and it was later implied that Solomon was that subject. In other places, such as chapter 8, verse 2 and chapter 10, verse 4, he speaks about the king in the third person, implying that the author is not the king. But whoever this author was, he lived in or around Jerusalem, as he considers the city central to his story. It's referenced 5 times in the first 2 chapters alone. The book also contains multiple viewpoints, which are sometimes contradictory with statements that were recently made, which has led some scholars to conclude that these are later insertions meant to bring a more optimistic tone to the book. Without these additions, I'm not sure Ecclesiastes would have been included in the Hebrew canon. The narrator of Ecclesiastes refers to Qoheleth in the third person and acknowledges the usefulness of wisdom, but finds traditional wisdom theology to be lacking. He points out that the events of life are a meaningless cycle of repetition, and nothing new ever occurs under the sun. Worse yet, The problem is compounded for the wise, as they're intelligent enough to recognize the futility of life, and thus suffer more than the ignorant fools around them. The work done during life goes to waste, so all progress is an exercise in futility. The only reasonable response to such meaningless tedium is to drink wine and enjoy what little time you have left. Ignorance is bliss, wisdom is a curse, so you might as well eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die. Occasionally, a later editor inserts a more optimistic sentence espousing traditional wisdom theology, reiterating the idea that the wise and righteous are rewarded while the wicked fools are punished, thus preserving the natural order. This, of course, contradicts the keen observations of the author, who knows better and has seen that sometimes the wise suffer and the wicked prosper. These odd passages, found in 2:26, 3:17, 7:18, 7:26, 11:9, 12:7, and 12:13-14, are all meant to bring Qoheleth in line with traditional wisdom theology. These inserted passages, which contradict the general message of the narrative and interrupt the flow of the text, are likely the only reason Ecclesiastes was included in the Jewish canon. So let's get started. The book begins with the words of Qoheleth, son of David, king in Jerusalem, though this could be translated the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. This line, like the heading of the next section, is probably a later addition. The body of the text is written in the first person, but the title line mentions the author in the third person. It's only in inserted verses like these that the author is identified with the king of Jerusalem and the royal line of David. We then read the opening words, "Vanity of vanities," says the teacher, "all things are vanity." This is a Hebrew way of expressing something to a great degree, like saying Holy of Holies or Song of Songs. So when he says vanity of vanities, he means that this is utterly futile. He goes on to state that there is no gain from all the toil of life. Generations come and go, the sun rises and sets, rivers flow into the ocean, but nothing ever actually changes. The world moves on as if humans didn't exist, their work changing nothing about the order of the world, and there is nothing truly new under the sun. We can see here in the opening verses of the first chapter the existential crisis which plagues the author. He can spend his entire life working towards some goal, but eventually he'll die and be forgotten, as so many in the past have gone before him. They've gone to dust, and even their memories have faded. It will all be for nothing, as if he never existed. So what would be the point in his labors? This brooding makes up verses 2 through 11 of chapter 1, a poem of the reflection of the futility of life. As we move into the second section, in which the teacher investigates life, we're treated to another heading, again a likely insertion as it switches from first person to third person before returning to the first person narrative. Here, let me show you what I mean. There is no remembrance of the former generations, neither shall there be any remembrance of the latter generations that are to come among those that come after. Qoheleth was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my mind to investigate in wisdom all the things under the sun. That phrase, Qoheleth was king over Israel in Jerusalem, simply doesn't fit. Verse 11 should flow into verse 13 with no interruption from verse 12. Qoheleth then tells us a bad business God has given to humans to be busied with. He then goes on to tell us that all the toils of humanity are futile, like chasing after the wind. So he increased his wisdom beyond all who had come before him in Jerusalem. But when he turned his mind to wisdom, he realized that the pursuit of knowledge was also vanity. He concludes, "In much wisdom there is much sorrow. Whoever increases knowledge increases grief." Or as we say today, ignorance is bliss. In chapter 2, Qoheleth recalls experimenting with different methods of adding meaning to his life. "I tried pleasure and enjoyment of good things, but that also was vanity. I tried laughter and mirth, and said, 'What good does this do?' Guided by wisdom, I probed my mind, how to beguile my senses with wine and take up folly until I should understand what is good for human beings to do under the heavens during the limited days of our lives. He goes on to explain how he undertook great works, built himself houses and planted vineyards, made gardens and orchards, acquired slaves, owned vast herds of cattle and flocks of sheep. He amassed great treasures of gold and silver to rival that of kings, along with singers and concubines, so that he had more than anyone else in Jerusalem before him. He obtained everything he desired, and his heart rejoiced. But when he thought of all he had done and all he had acquired, he realized it was pointless. Our teacher then turns his attention to the study of wisdom and folly, a topic you'll be well acquainted with if you listen to the Proverbs episodes. He lays out some basic tenets of wisdom theology, such as wisdom profiting over folly, wisdom being compared to light and folly being compared to darkness, and wise people having eyes while fools walk in darkness. Then he throws us a curveball by announcing in verse 14 that both the wise and the fool suffer the same fate. So I said in my heart, if the fool's lot is to befall me also, why should I be wise? Because the wise and the fool both end up dead, and both will be forgotten, there's no profit in seeking wisdom. That too is vanity, for after all, the wise man dies just as the fool. In verse 18, he turns his attention to the problem of toiling his life away for the benefit of others. The problem, as he sees it, is that he works all of his life collecting riches and orchards and slaves, only to have some fool inherit it all after he dies. He does all the work, and someone undeserving benefits from it. Every day he struggles with toil and grief and deals with sleepless nights, just for the benefit of others. His conclusion is that there is nothing to life but to eat, drink, and reward oneself for one's own toil. Suddenly the tone and message changes as he says that even this is a reward from God, and those who please God are rewarded with wisdom and knowledge and joy. This contradicts the primary narrative in which wisdom and knowledge bring only grief. These short verses are added in an attempt to bring classic wisdom theology back into the story. Chapter 3 brings us the catalogue of times and the problem of retribution. The first is a poem about the cyclical nature of events and the idea that there is a correct time for everything. For everything there is a season, a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to reap, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. The poem goes on like this, each phrase stating that there is an appropriate time for each action and its opposite. The times are constantly changing, yet endlessly repetitive. Yahweh has created a neatly organized system in which nothing happens out of its apportioned time. See Enoch 5:2. And all God's works go on from year to year forever, and all the tasks they accomplish for him, and they do not change, but do as God ordained. The only real constant in life is change. Just when you feel you've got the hang of life, it's time to be doing something else. This poem covers the first 8 verses of chapter 3, and in verse 9 we see the author's commentary on the idea of the changing cycles of nature and their effects on human lives. He rhetorically asks, what profit have workers from their toils? He has studied the tasks that God has assigned to mortals. He has a set time for everything, but put a desire for timelessness into the hearts of men. The timeless refers to the hidden eternity of the universe, the secret things known only to God, such as the depth of the oceans or the place where the sun goes at night. This sudden shift from poem to the author's musings may indicate that the poem was a later insertion. If removed, the subject found in chapter 3, verse 9 seems to reference the material at the conclusion of chapter 2. A few verses into his musings, the author states that he understands now that there's nothing left to do but to find enjoyment where one can in life, just by eating and drinking and trying to benefit from one's own toil. Then suddenly, at the end of verse 13, he proclaims that this is a gift from God, contradicting the tone and message of the body of the text, a sure sign that this verse was also added. This section concludes by stating that the current condition of the world has already occurred in the past and will be seen again in the future as the universe repeats its natural cycle which God has arranged. The second section of chapter 3 concerns the problem of retribution. This spans verses 16 to 22. The trouble, he finds, is that both good and wicked will be judged harshly. Whether good or evil, humans share the fate of beasts. When their allotted time is over, they'll die as they have the same breath of life as the wild animals, and thus hold no advantage over them. Both humans and animals go to the same place after death, as both are made of dust, and so to dust they shall return. This does away with the idea that humans go to some special place and that we're superior to animals. The author even rhetorically asks, who knows if the breath of life of mortals goes upward and the breath of life of animals goes earthward? Because of this, there's no benefit for mortals over animals, so there's nothing for them but to rejoice in their toil, as no one knows what will happen to them after death. But what of this toil? The question is addressed in chapter 4, a section entitled The Vanity of Toil, which, unsurprisingly, presents a pessimistic view of the subject. Our author has seen all the oppression that occurs under the sun and how victims cry with none to comfort them. They're mistreated and abused by their oppressors, and the only fortunate ones are those who are already dead, because they're no longer suffering. And the unborn are better still, as they have never suffered, nor seen the wickedness of earth. Then he saw that much of the toil of man was simple rivalry between competing individuals, with neither gaining much. And those who rest from the endless work are consumed by hunger, so you're stuck working endlessly, or you go without. And both are vanity. He then turns his attention to lonely people, those who lack friends or siblings. They toil away their lives and have no one to share their time with, and can't enjoy the money that they earn. They're deprived of the goodness of life that friendship brings, and so their hard work is meaningless. And if they should encounter difficult times, they have no one to help them, and no one to comfort them. The chapter ends with a warning against offering sacrifices to God without obedience to the law. Disobedience was the act of a fool, and thus was evil. Proper worship of God is continued in chapter 5 when we read, "Be not hasty in your utterance, and let not your heart be quick to utter a promise in God's presence. God is in heaven, and you are on earth, therefore let your words be few." So it isn't the amount of words spoken in acknowledgement of God's greatness, but the sincerity of those words. This is the proper way to worship the Creator. A fool speaks with many words, while the wise speak with sincerity. And when you make a vow to God, don't delay in its fulfillment. Better to promise nothing to God than to not fulfill a vow. In verse 7, the topic switches to the oppression of the poor. You shouldn't be surprised to see a violation of rights and oppression from those in power, though a wise ruler should be concerned with these things. So there's hope that a king would be just, but they have no real expectation of it. So again, we see this familiar twist on wisdom theology. Proverbs 8:15 tells us a wise king will rule justly, and Ecclesiastes acknowledges that, but tell us we can't expect it to actually happen. The ideal circumstance established in wisdom theology rarely manifests in reality. The greedy are never satisfied regardless of how much wealth they acquire, and their vast wealth brings them no joy, so this too is meaningless. The tired worker sleeps better than the idle rich. His conclusion is that the only good in life comes from using what little profit can be gained from honest work to eat, drink, and find some small enjoyment to occupy one's time on earth before death. And that, as the author sees it, is our lot in life. Chapter 5 concludes, again with a latter and more optimistic insertion, that humans won't dwell on the shortness of futility of life because God allows them to busy themselves with the joy of their hearts. This, of course, contradicts the entire message of Ecclesiastes, which is an entire book dwelling on the shortness and futility of life because people can't find joy in their hearts despite a closeness to God. It almost feels that, as the book progresses, the attempts to bring it in line with Proverbs are becoming more and more desperate and more clumsy. The futility of seeking enjoyment in life continues in the final portion of Qoheleth's investigation of life in chapter 6. He brings to our attention another great evil which weighs heavily on his mind, that of the inability to enjoy what has been earned. One may toil all his life to obtain things which might bring him joy, only to perish and have those things passed to a younger generation. What good have those items and riches brought to him if he is now dead before he's had a chance to use and enjoy them? His wealth is passed on to others and his name is forgotten. And whether he enjoys them or not, it's of no matter, because in the end, he dies the same death as a man who lived without riches and wealth. Whether he lived a short and wealthy life or 2,000 years of poverty, he's still dead and forgotten. Life is simple toil, but the need is never satisfied, and the wise don't profit over the fools. So what's the point in conducting oneself through wisdom? So even this is vanity, like chasing after the wind. The next part of Ecclesiastes is called Qoheleth's Conclusions. This begins with chapter 6, verse 10, and finishes at chapter 11, verse 6, and it starts with an introduction. As this introduction is only 3 verses long, it really should have been included with chapter 7, but when the Bible was divided into chapters and verses, this chapter division was placed after the introduction for some reason. This introduction states that for mortals to contend with God is vanity because of his strength. We saw this theme in Job chapter 9 as he views receiving justice from God as foolish, as there was no power which could take God to task for his unfair treatment of humans. This unsavory element of wisdom theology rears its head again here in Qoheleth. Following the introduction are 2 sections that deal with Qoheleth's conclusions. The first, which covers chapters 7 and 8, concerns the inability for humans to discover the best course of action. Sometimes entitled, "Man Cannot Discover What is Good for Him," or "No One Can Find Out the Best Way of Acting," this section deals with uncertainty in life and the complications that brings. The second section begins at chapter 9 and ends with chapter 11, verse 6. The focus of that section is uncertainty concerning the future and how misfortune can strike when least expected. So let's begin with section A. Man can't discover what's good for him. Or, as Britney Spears would say, whoops, I did it again. This section opens with a few proverbs such as, "A good name is better than a good ointment, and the day of death is better than the day of birth." Glad to see that he's consistently pessimistic. Let's see if things improve in verse 2, shall we? "It's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, for that is the end of every mortal, and the living should take it to heart." Okay, maybe third time's the charm, right? "Sorrow is better than laughter. When the face is sad, the heart grows wise." Huh. Let's check verse 4. "The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of merriment." So ignorance is bliss. I think we learned that earlier. Will the tone of this chapter ever improve? Let's check out verses 5 and 6. "It is better to listen to the rebuke of the wise than to listen to the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns underfoot, so is the fool's laughter." Okay, well that's certainly better. Constructive criticism from smart people is a learning experience. Finally, we've departed from the pessimistic tone. Oh wait, that wasn't the end of verse 6. It concludes with, "And this too is vanity." The Proverbs continue, and we learned that it's better to be patient than to be proud, which is sound advice. And also, we shouldn't let anger lodge itself in our hearts, but it's also better for something to end than to begin. We find what might be another later insertion in verse 11 as we learn that wisdom is a great inheritance and profits those who practice it, though we've already seen that the original author thought that too was vanity. In verse 13, he asks rhetorically, "Who can make straight what God has made crooked?" A callback to Ecclesiastes 1:15. If God made it one way, there's no point in trying to change it. Just accept the way that it is. This is reiterated in the following verse when we read, "On a good day, enjoy good things, and on an evil day, consider this. Both the one and the other God has made, so that no one may find the least fault in him." This is similar to Isaiah 45:7, where we learn that God makes good and evil, light and darkness. He then muses on the topic of justice, saying he has seen the righteous suffering injustice while the wicked live long lives. People shouldn't be wicked or foolish, but they also shouldn't seek to be very righteous or wise, since the path might not do them much good and could very well lead to their own ruination. You probably didn't think that the Bible would be telling you not to be too good. Be not just to excess, and be not over wise. Why work toward your own ruin? Ecclesiastes 7:16. Qoheleth states that there is much that is undiscoverable, knowledge that is hidden by God. He recognizes that wickedness is foolish, but there's still much that he can't learn because finding it is simply impossible. After this, he turns his attention to women in verse 26, who are more bitter than death, and whose hearts are like a hunter's trap. He asks for God to deliver him from women, but knows that the man who displeases God will be ensnared by her. Essentially, Qoheleth sees women as a punishment designed and placed by God to torment wicked men. According to him, in verse 28, only one man in 1,000 is worthy, but not a single woman. In chapter 8, he examines the advice to heed authority. He begins by instructing the reader to obey the commands of the king and not to linger in an unpleasant situation. The king's word is law and shouldn't be questioned. There's a time for everything, but it's terrible for mortals that they don't know what is to come. Essentially, it's obvious that we don't know what we should be doing until it's too late. We're surprised by changes that disrupt our lives because we can't see the future and prepare for them. He saw the wicked being punished, but understood this too to be vanity, because their punishment always came too late. They did evil 100 times, instead of being punished promptly, so their evil was allowed to spread and bring harm to others. There are those who are just, but are treated as if they committed evil, and those who are wicked, who are treated as though they were just. So he once again reaches the conclusion that pursuing a just life is vanity, and the only sensible option is to eat, drink, and be merry for the short time that one has on earth. The next portion of Qoheleth's conclusions is entitled, "No One Knows the Future," or "Man Doesn't Know What Will Come After Him." It begins with chapter 9 and concludes with chapter 11, verse 6. As is typical for this book, this section begins on a pessimistic tone. The just and the wise, their deeds are in the hand of God. Mortals can't tell love from hatred. Everything is the same for everyone, the same lot for the just and for the wicked, for the good, for the clean, and for the unclean, for the one who offers sacrifice and the one who does not. This is the worst among all things done under the sun, that there is one lot for all. We've seen this idea before, the despairing sense of meaninglessness concerning the shared fates of the righteous and the wicked. It permeates the book of Job until the author demands that there be some form of cosmic justice, some type of divine judge who might set the scales to balance, to punish the wicked and reward the wise. I said that this was the kernel upon which the idea of segregated afterlife would grow, and here we find it again. The classic Jewish theology of a shared dismal fate is unpalatable, and the desire for reform is expressed in these pages. Or, as it was put in The Birth of Satan by Gregory Mobley and T.J. Ray, this type of storytelling sought to reveal the reason for the frustrated hopes of a people who could not reconcile their misfortunes with their theology. In chapter 9, verse 4, we find a likely insertion. It reads, "For whoever is chosen among all the living has hope. A live dog is better off than a dead lion." Not only does this contradict the general message of the text, it also seems to interrupt the flow from verse 3 to verse 5, as verse 5 seems to be a reference to verse 3, not a reference to verse 4. We find the familiar eat, drink, and be merry in verse 7 as the author tells us, "Go, eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, because it is now that God favors your works." We should live in the moment rather than dwelling on the past or worrying over the future, because, as the title of this section suggests, we can't know what is to come. Enjoy life with the wife that you love, all the days of the vain life granted to you under the sun. Do what you can now, with what little time you have, because there will be no chance to do anything after you die and descend into Sheol. In verse 11, he tells us that he understood a race was not won by the swift, nor the battle won by the valiant. For misfortune strikes at unexpected times, just as a fish doesn't know the day it will be taken up by the net. Such is how mortals are caught by evil when it suddenly afflicts them. In other words, plan all you wish, the future is still uncertain, and your next disaster will still surprise you. The tone then shifts to bring us a parable about a city besieged by a mighty king. Though inside lived a wise but poor man. He used his great wisdom to save the city, though no one remembered him. This parable seems to simply be inserted to give truth to a proverb like, "Better to be a wise beggar than a foolish king," and the chapter ends with just such a proverb. The quiet words of the wise are better heeded than the shout of a ruler of fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one bungler destroys much good. The recitation of Proverbs continues through the first 4 verses of chapter 10. Dead flies corrupt and spoil the perfumer's oil. More weighty than wisdom or wealth is a little folly. And the wise heart turns to the right, but the foolish heart to the left. In verse 5, he notices another evil beneath the sun, a fool who occupies a high position while greatness sits in lowly places. He has seen slaves on horseback while princes walked. This reversal of fortunes violates traditional wisdom theology and is admonished throughout the book of Proverbs. And speaking of Proverbs, verse 8 returns to listing Proverbs, and they fill much of the chapter. We have familiar sayings like, "Whoever digs a pit may fall into it," meaning that people often pay for their own mistakes. But we're also treated to new proverbs like verse 9. "Whoever quarries stones may be hurt by them, and whoever chops wood is in danger from it." It isn't often that wisdom literature warns against the dangers of honest work, but there it is. Though if we look deeper, we see that this is a warning that dangers lie where you least expect them. Everyday tasks can provide a hiding place for misfortune. Verses 10 and 11 advise that you use your skills to make your work easier and safer. One suggests sharpening your axe before chopping wood, while the other encourages caution when charming snakes to avoid a fatal bite. The wise win favor with their words, while the fool prattles on speaking madness that no one can understand. In verse 16, we find a song that issues a warning about the unexpected nature of calamity. Misfortune may come from a youthful king, drunken princes, lazy workers, speaking ill of those in power, and the speedy nature of gossip. The first 2 verses of chapter 11 seem to be meant for the entrepreneur. They suggest being adventurous when investing in any business venture and diversifying one's investments to guard against misfortune. Exporting your surplus to foreign markets may net a greater profit, and splitting your focus can reduce the chance of substantial losses. Just as calamity may strike when least expected, so can good fortune. This is conveyed as a warning against being too cautious. A farmer who constantly worries about the weather will never sow his seeds, so one must take risks in order to be successful, because sitting idle will always result in failure. The book of Ecclesiastes has two endings. The first is a concluding poem which begins in chapter 11, verse 7, and ends with chapter 12, verse 8. It's called the Poem of Youth and Old Age. The second is the epilogue, which picks up in chapter 12, verse 9, and ends with verse 14. We're warned in the poem to enjoy our fleeting time on earth while we can, to make the most of our youth, for old age will be upon us before we know it, and death could come at any moment. The idea that one should find enjoyment in life, despite its meaningless nature, is preserved here and expressed through the lines, "Rejoice, O youth, while you are young, and let your heart be glad in the days of your youth." And as we've come to expect, the pessimistic view that the righteous will suffer the same fate as the wicked immediately follows. Yet understand regarding all this that God will bring you to judgment. But the main detail of note is how this poem wraps up the book as a whole. Throughout the poem of youth and old age, we find references to ideas mentioned earlier in the book of Ecclesiastes. Just as you can expect your eyes to eventually fail, you should also follow what your eyes find beautiful while you can still see. We find a return to the idea that there's a time for everything. When we read about the changing of seasons and the grinding of grain, when birds and daughters sing and the trees are in bloom, we find beautiful imagery such as envisioning life as a silver cord which can be snapped or a fragile golden bowl easily broken. We all are dust which returns to the earth, and our spirits are the life breath of God, which is reclaimed by Him at our death. And of course, the poem ends where the book begins. "Vanity of vanities," says Qoheleth, "all things are vanity." Though the book should have ended here, and it would have been perfect if it had, editors felt it needed an epilogue, so we're treated to one in chapter 12, verse 9. The purpose is to establish Qoheleth as a wise teacher and a scribe, but it also warns that other works on this topic are needless, and studying them serves only to bring weariness. Besides being wise, we're told, Qoheleth taught the people knowledge, weighed, scrutinized, and arranged many proverbs. These proverbs are likened to a shepherd's goad, poking and prodding one where the shepherd wishes to lead. Finally, the book ends by encouraging the reader to simply fear God and keep His commandments because this is the true concern of mankind. It seems to criticize the overall teaching of Ecclesiastes. Where the book dwells on the futility of life and the senseless nature of the universe, and the fact that the wise share the same fate as the wicked, the final statements seem to tell the reader to disregard all of that in favor of blind obedience to the deity and to the law code. So what are we to make of Ecclesiastes? On the one hand, it tells us that all of our labors are pointless, and even moral behavior has no ultimate payout. But on the other hand, we're reminded that there is still beauty in the world and should strive for wisdom and understanding. There's a time for song and dance and joy, and also a time for misery, suffering, and death. The story reminds us that life is fleeting, and with time, even the memory of us will be erased. But it also encourages us to seek out beauty and enjoyment while we have the chance to do so. This is a complicated and introspective writing that's not suited for inclusion in the Hebrew Bible. With the exception of a handful of clumsily inserted verses, the text contains no real theology or moral messages. And where theology does present itself, it runs in opposition of what any temple priest would preach, thus the need for interpolations, which bring this peculiar piece of wisdom literature more in line with something like the Book of Proverbs. What can we take away from such a text? Personally, I would say it's the idea that we should simply enjoy life, for the time is later than we think. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. You can help the show by giving a review on your favorite podcast app or by heading over to dragonsandgenesis.com, where you can find links to donate, join my Patreon, send books from my wish list, find a list of recommended reading, and get information on the latest episodes. And as always, thank you for listening.